Hi guys, welcome to the middle childhood lecture. So we are going to jump straight into emotions and self-development. So let's start with talking about the main features of kind of emotional self-regulation and understanding in middle school years, middle childhood years, and how other life stages compare. So emotionally, middle childhood is generally a time of stability and contentment. Go to the next slide. There's been a lot of research that has been done with what's called the experience sampling method, and this is often used to measure individuals' emotional and physical states. By having them respond, they gave them beepers, pagers, and it would go off randomly, and then they would tell them what their emotional and physical states were at the time. And what they found with these children is that emotional self-regulation really becomes firmly established as children are increasingly involved in contexts that require maturity. So, and that's something that I think is really important to take into consideration because we often coddle our children, the whole helicopter parenting thing, and we wait for our children to be mature before we give them responsibilities that require maturation. However, the research shows that until children are given those responsibilities, they don't mature. So, emotional self regulation, the ability to control yourself, the ability to behave like an adult and not be a child, happens because children are given responsibilities. They don't develop maturity first and then they are ready for responsibilities. Okay, so keep that in mind if you are raising children. Your children need to be given responsibilities in order to become responsible people and in order to be able to regulate their emotions. Emotional understanding really advances as kids learn to recognize their own emotional states. They also learn, unfortunately, well, maybe not unfortunately, there's pros and cons, to be able to conceal their true emotions and instead display socially acceptable emotions. So, in some sense, that is negative in the fact that we learn during these middle childhood years to bury our emotions and to basically lie about how we feel. But on the other hand, there are definitely advantages to that. You don't want everybody necessarily to know how you feel, to know all your business. And there's situations where it's not appropriate to display emotions. So it is an important thing for children to learn. And kids also realize at this age that other people are concealing their true emotions as well. And the really good outcome of this is that it increases children's ability to have empathy for other people. So they understand that even though you're maybe acting happy, you're not necessarily feeling that way. And so this is really when we see empathy for others begin to develop, as in middle childhood. So, self-concept and self-esteem also are changing in middle childhood, and explains how different ways of thinking about the self are rooted, or you can explain that by looking at how those concepts are rooted in cultural beliefs. So self-concept is how we view and evaluate ourselves, and it really changes from an external basis in early childhood years to an internal basis during middle childhood. So little kids, they simply evaluate themselves. I'm a little girl and I have brown hair and blue eyes and I like dogs. And it's just sort of the facts about themselves is how they understand who they are. But in middle childhood, they begin to really understand their emotions and their sense of self. So if you ask a child like ages 5 to 8 to tell you about themselves, then a kid might say, I'm a boy, I'm tall, I like to play soccer. Those are concrete characteristics. But in mid to late middle childhood, the kid is more likely to include internal characteristics such as I'm friendly, I'm smart, I'm nice, people like me. Okay, so it's more about who they are as a person. And then during this period, children are also beginning to make much more accurate social comparisons. And then they get much better at this as they get older, which is one reason why like giving awards to everybody doesn't work with kids, with older kids. It might work with, say, kindergartners, but by the time you get into middle and then late childhood, children, they can evaluate themselves and they know that they didn't earn first place. They know that they didn't deserve a prize. And research has actually shown that that decreases their self-esteem because really you're patronizing them. You're patting them on the head. Oh, you did terrible, but we're going to pretend you didn't. And that doesn't make anybody feel good, including a child. So self-concept at this age is really influenced by, well, self-concept in general is influenced by your age. It's influenced by your peers, and it's influenced by the social context. All right. So self-esteem is a person's overall sense of worth and well-being. It declines slightly from early to middle childhood. For most of middle childhood, self-esteem is high, and it becomes more differentiated as children develop their self-concepts for a variety of areas. So there's not just this overall sense of self. I mean, self esteem is like the overall evaluation, but it's characterized by how well you do in various areas. And children actually, well, and people in general, you can do terrible in a certain area, but if you do great in another one, then you can still have high self esteem. So you don't, as an adult and as a child, you don't have to be good at everything. I have to sneeze. Oh, I hate when you have to sneeze and then you don't sneeze. But like, when I was a kid, I wasn't athletic. I didn't do good at sports, but I was an excellent reader. I did really good in general academics. Um, my teachers always patted me on the back for, my ability to do well in various other areas. So for me, not being good in sports didn't hurt my self-esteem because I excelled in other areas. Now, sadly, I guess, physical appearance is actually the strongest predictor of self-esteem in middle childhood and the teenage years. So I know none of us like that, but unfortunately it is a fact of life. And so it's not necessarily like your child has to be gorgeous or something, but make sure that you're paying attention to your kids wearing clean clothes. Make sure they're not wearing like seriously out of style clothes. Like when I was a kid, I remember my mom was so nice and she sewed us a lot of clothes. And she made us pants that were made out of corduroy, and it was just not in style. And I remember not really being made fun of, but a little bit of teasing. The schools I went to, there wasn't a lot of, like, kids weren't mean like what you see in movies. Um, but yeah, I just remember I hate these pants, even though it was so wonderful of my mom to do it. But then when I got to high school, corduroy was totally in style. And I'm like, my mom was just a few years too early. So it's little silly stuff like that. But you do have to remember it is just a fact of life that the better you look, and really this is at any age, the better people view you. It's actually called is it called the halo syndrome, I think, or halo complex, something like that, where you're if you look good, then you must be an angel. You must be wearing a halo. You must be perfect. You couldn't possibly do things wrong. And so, unfortunately, the better your physical appearance, the more positively people view you, which of course helps your self esteem. So, do remember that if you are raising kids, and even for yourself, if you want to appear better to people, then work on your external appearance. A little bit of makeup and making sure your hair is washed and brushed is certainly helpful. All right, anyhow, moving on. So if we look at culture, why these slides aren't going to the next one. Okay. So culture also significantly affects who you are. Cultural differences in self-concept are substantial in middle childhood, and you can see this by what we call the independent self and the interdependent self. So the independent self is when we are encouraged to think about ourselves as individuals, and of course we see this in individualistic cultures. The interdependent, inter means between, encourages the importance of the group, which you see in collectivistic cultures. So collectivistic cultures promote the interdependent self and who you are is defined by your relationships, whereas the independent self encourages self-reflection and encourages pride in who you are, which that is a very American thing. So in collectivistic cultures, they're encouraged to like put their others' needs before their own, and high self-esteem is actually not encouraged because high self-esteem means you think of yourself individually as better than others, and that's really anti-collectivistic. And so they prefer people to be humble, prefer people to have lower self-esteem. So high self-esteem is not necessarily the end-all, be-all, although it's certainly important. And just because someone's from a collectivistic culture doesn't mean they have terrible self-esteem. It's just more of a humble self-esteem, which definitely has some pros to it. Some cons, though, are you tend to maybe not be as ambitious, maybe not as motivated. Denmark, for instance, is kind of in between. They're individualistic, but they have a lot of collectivistic values. And they have what's called the Law of Yonta. If I remember that right, I think it's the Law of Yonta, which says basically be satisfied with who you are and where you are in life because you're no better than anybody else and you don't deserve to have anything more than other people have, which on the one sense increases contentment in life and humility, but on the other side, and I had this conversation with a Danish person, so I'm not trying to be insulting. I like Denmark and Danish culture. I've visited and everything. So, but he said basically the Danish invented Legos, and that's about it. Um, no, they did more than that, but compared to what individualistic cultures like England or America or France have accomplished, their accomplishments are less. Like there's not as many Nobel Prizes, for instance, going to Danish people. There's tons going to Americans. And one reason is because they're content. They're taught to be content with their lot in life. And why do you need to go to the moon? Denmark is fine. Although the Danish did invade England and a lot of other places, so anyhow. So approaches to parenting, how you parent kids vary based on these views of the self and what is considered important for the child to learn culturally. So you're going to parent very different if you're an individualistic parent than if you are a collectivistic parent, which I hope is obvious to you. And many cultures will combine elements of each concept of self rather than being super extreme. So that's kind of what I was saying, that even in collectivistic cultures, they still have good self-esteem. So it's kind of, there's a combination. You want your children to feel good about themselves in a collectivistic culture, but you also, of even more priority is making sure that they fit into the group and that they consider others' needs. And Americans or other individualistic cultures, primarily we're concerned about our individual child and how they do in life, but of course we want them to get along with people and have friends and to be empathetic and consider others. So it's just a difference in emphasis. All right, now gender. Our beliefs and behaviors regarding gender change in middle childhood, and this includes cultural variations. Children's ideas of gender roles become much more sharply defined in middle childhood, so gender differentiation has solidified by the time you hit 6, 7 years old, so the start of middle childhood. Early childhood with like toddlers, they don't understand gender at first. They get that they're a girl or a boy, but just because you told them they are, and they're trying to figure out what that means, which is why it is much easier in that age range to screw up a child's gender and give them gender identity disorder. But by the start of middle childhood, kids really have that sharply defined sense of gender and gender roles. So children are socialized to develop gender-specific personality traits, especially in more traditional cultures. And these include, like, boys, of course, are independent and tough. Troublemakers, maybe. Girls are more nurturing, more compliant. A lot of times when girls behave well, they're told that that's pretty behavior. So there's kind of a cross between obedience or compliance and looks, which is kind of weird, but a lot of people do that. In developed countries, gender norms are not usually enforced rigidly, so there's a lot more flexibility during middle childhood. And children's gender attitudes and their gender behavior, such as like certain personality traits, occupations, school subjects, kids are becoming much more stereotyped in their attitudes and behaviors surrounding gender. And play becomes more gender segregated in middle childhood, and that's regardless of the type of culture. Every culture, boys like to play with boys and girls like to play with girls in the middle childhood years. That's just kind of how we're designed. And one reason is because they finally figured out what it means to be a girl or a boy, and so now they're going to do girlness or they're going to do boyness because that's what you do. And then we'll see as children get older that they move away from that gender rigidity to being much more flexible, and then they get gender rigid during the teenage years again, and then into adulthood you become more gender flexible again. But if you don't, it's like your first day at college. You were very concerned about what were other people doing, what's expected of me, what the rules are, and then by the time you're a senior in college, you break those rules all you want because you know what you can get away with and what you can't get away with, and so you're going to be bending rules all the time. The same thing happens with gender. Little kids in this age don't they know what gender is now, but they don't know the rules of it. And so they become very rigid about following those rules until they learn where you can be flexible and where you can't be flexible. So a boy knows that in our modern society, he could probably go to school wearing a salmon colored t-shirt, but if he goes to school wearing a pink t-shirt, he might get teased. He knows at home, and he has sisters, he could mess around with them and wear their tutus, and it's just kind of a joke. But if you go to school wearing a tutu, the other boys might beat you up or something. So you know what the rules are. You know where you can be flexible as you go into later childhood. Play is becoming more gender segregated. And in terms of gender self-perception, boys want to have masculine traits and girls want to have feminine traits, but there is, even in this age, there's more flexibility with girls. Girls can have some feminine and a few masculine traits. Being a tomboy is okay. So girls can be a bit more masculine and it's accepted. But in this age range, if boys are feminine, then there's a lot of harsh teasing. All right. Is this not working? Okay, there we go. All right, so, oh, I talked about this already. Okay. All right, so let's talk about some more social and cultural context of middle childhood. In particular, we'll start with family relations. So there are distinctive features of family relations in middle childhood. And we'll talk some about the consequences of parental divorce and remarriage. So across cultures, the family provides children with care, and direct, close supervision, although there's a lot of variation amongst cultures with that. But during middle childhood, kids are moving more towards co-regulation, which means that parents are providing guidelines and assistance and instruction, but the kid is now capable of independent, self-directed behavior. So the child's regulating him or herself as well as the parent is regulating the child. So they're co-regulating. So at this age, they don't need constant supervision and monitoring because they are hopefully demonstrating that they have learned rules and routines. They've taken on responsibilities. And of course, like I said earlier, if you haven't given your child responsibilities at this age, they're going to be much more immature than if you have. For instance, I live in a farming community out here in Lucerne, and a lot of kids grow up, you have to go out and feed the chickens. You have to make sure animals are watered. If an animal is sick, you're right there with mom or dad helping out. And so there are a lot of responsibilities that farm kids are given that city kids aren't given. And so you often see much more emotional maturity and ability to self-regulate than what urban children get in general. And there's exceptions to that, of course, but as a general rule, because rural kids have more responsibilities in life, then they become more responsible. So in part, the amounts of independence a child is given, that also depends on the child's gender, and that's very culturally affected. Some people believe boys should have tons of responsibilities. Others believe that the girls should be responsible. Americans are a bit more egalitarian. Boys and girls should have responsibilities. But in general, we tend to spoil boys a bit more than girls and expect girls to be more helpful. We believe boys develop slower, and so you can't have as high expectations for them. But there's so many subcultures in America that's a really hard generalization to make. Now, having siblings tends to be very beneficial for children, mutually beneficial for the siblings. Uh, Sibling rivalry and jealousy is definitely still a problem in middle childhood years. It actually peaks, conflict peaks in middle childhood, but that's normal and it's not bad. I know it drives parents insane, but the more siblings you have, the more you learn to get along with people. And research actually shows that every sibling you have up to 7 siblings decreases the chances of divorce 10% per sibling. So you have a 70% less chance of getting divorced than the average person, or a single child, an only child, I guess you could say. So when your children are fighting and it's driving you crazy, just smile and tell yourself they're learning to regulate their emotions and learning to have conflict management. So that's actually a really good thing. And really, as a parent, you should not be stepping in constantly to regulate those situations for the kids. Try to have them work it out. So if you hear them fighting in a room, don't go into the room unless it gets really bad. Let them try to work it out. If it sounds like they're not working it out, then fine, step in and try to help them through it. Or another thing you can do is when a kid comes to you and says, Susie did this, then you can talk to the child and say whatever needs to be said. Now go back and talk to your sister about this and try to work it out. And put the responsibility on the child to resolve the conflict with their sibling rather than you do it for them. That really teaches them a lot. It's not going to the next slide again. Come on. I believe in you. Why aren't you working? I think that's the wrong slide. Okay. Oh wow, we really got out of order here. That's not where we're at. This is where we're at. Okay. So let's talk about the family forms. So families, of course, come in many different forms, such as married parents, single parents, divorced parents, step parents, blended families with step children. In the United States, 63% of children are living with 2 biological and or adoptive parents, and 20% live with a single mom, and 6% live with a parent and a step parent. Parents or caregivers can also have varying sexual orientations, which changes the makeup of the families. There's not a lot of research done on that. Most research that has been done has not found negative ramifications to having homosexual parents. There does not seem to be an increased rate of the children becoming homosexual, which is a concern that has been cited in the past. The only research I have seen, and there could be more out there that I'm unaware of, but the only negative research I've seen is that a daughter of 2 homosexual fathers is much more likely to grow up to be emotionally distant and have problems maintaining relationships. And that's one study, which, if you understand the way scientific research is done, you shouldn't make generalizations necessarily just on one study, but it is a potential issue. And it does make sense. I mean, not having the ability to connect with a woman could affect your emotions and so on. But yeah, so just something to consider, but there's definitely not enough research out there on that subject. You could also live with like extended family members or multi-generational families, adopted families. In my household, because I have a farm, and multi-generational households are great for farms. So my mom and I have luckily we have multiple houses on the property, but my mom and I live on the same property. Then for a while, my sister and her kids were living on the property. Now they live on the farm next door, which is really cool. And then my grandma was also living with us for a while, for a few years. So we had 4 generations living on the farm together, which was awesome. Very old-fashioned, but I enjoyed it. Okay, so what else are we talking about here? Single-parent families, children born to single mothers or even fathers, could be the result of a divorce, could be the result of never being married at all. Also, we see an increasing rate of women who are choosing to be single mothers, not necessarily because they don't want to be married, but maybe they haven't found somebody, and so through modern technology, they decide to have children anyhow. And so there is an increasing rate of single motherhood over the past 50 years. It's especially high among African Americans and in Northern Europe, interestingly. So that's like Scandinavian countries. Uh, Children in single-parent households tend to be a bit more mature than the average child, tend to have a bit better emotional self-regulation. And one of the reasons is because they're required to contribute more to household duties. They have more responsibilities. Unfortunately, children in single-parent families are also more likely to be raised in poverty, which can very often result in physical problems like malnutrition, behavioral problems, low academic achievement. So a child can be raised in a single-parent household and turn out wonderful. But it's like one of those situations where the cards are stacked against you, so you're better off, obviously, having a marriage with two supportive parents. But that does not mean that you have destroyed your child's life because you're a single parent. It's just a bit harder, a lot harder in many cases. Some single parent families do really well if they have like a high SES, socioeconomic status. They have good social support. An extended family, particularly with grandparents, is very advantageous for single parent families. So kids from those situations tend to do much better. It's interestingly, I heard a statistic the other day that in killer whale pods, the killer whale pods that the baby killer whale's grandmother is still around has a 40% higher chance of survival. So a baby killer whale is 40% more likely to survive to adulthood if grandma's around, which I think is really adorable. All right, now killer whales don't have divorce, but we certainly do, and children's responses to divorce are something to really consider. Divorce rates have risen dramatically since like the early 1900s, especially in 1960. It began to increase and become much more common. When my mom was a kid, and she was born in 1960, a woman, a single mother, moved into the neighborhood, and she was divorced. And my mom can remember being told, do not play with her kids, don't go over to her house, she's a divorced woman. And they were allowed to have nothing to do with her. And my mom had some cousins who faced some severe physical and psychological abuse in their family, and their mom told them that she was going to get a divorce, and they begged her not to. They'd rather have the divorce than the social stigma, or I'm sorry, they'd rather have the abuse than the social stigma that came with divorce. So the attitudes to divorce have changed dramatically, and divorce peaked in the 1980s, and it has decreased since then with every generation since the baby boomer generation. The baby boomers had the highest rate of divorce. Generation X had lower rates of divorce, but also a lot less got married. Xennials, then millennials, they all decreased getting married in the first place, and so their divorce rates have dropped as well. Children respond negatively to divorce. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone, and especially boys are very sensitive to divorce. And children are most sensitive in the first 2 years, and of course, unsurprisingly, the biggest predictor of children having a hard time with divorce is if it is a high conflict divorce between the parents. Children are much more likely to have externalizing problems such as conduct issues, anger, rage issues, and internalizing problems such as depression and anxiety. And they almost always, if not always, blame themselves for the divorce. It's how kids think. It's just how their mind works. About 25% of children of divorce have severe emotional or behavioral problems compared to 10% of children in married families. So divorce obviously is having a horrendous effect on children. The worst outcomes are usually experienced about 1 year post-divorce and begin to improve near to normal by year 2 for girls. Boys continue to experience problems for about 5 years and sometimes longer. So again, divorce has a much more severe effect on boys than girls. Now, one possible conflict to that research is that girls tend to internalize more, and so they might seem better adjusted, but you're just not, you don't know what's going on inside them. So they're behaving just fine, but really internally they're having issues that you don't see. So that's a possibility. Or it could be that girls just adjust faster to divorce. If the quality of the relationship between the family members is good, then children have minimal problems. So, for instance, the actors Demi Moore and Bruce Willis, they got a divorce, but Bruce Willis moved across the street from Demi Moore, and just he's their father across the street, and the kids go back and forth as often as they want, and him and Demi Moore seem to have a great relationship. As a matter of fact, I heard that he spent the coronavirus lockdown with Demi Moore and his kids with her instead of his own current wife. So those kids seem to have adjusted really well to the divorce because they still have their dad, and there's still a relationship between their mom and dad. They might be divorced, but there's still a good relationship there, and so they're much better adjusted. So mother's parenting tends to suffer from a divorce as a result of having increased household responsibilities and limited financial support. So this causes more stress, and that may make her less responsive, may make her less warm, may make her more punitive, meaning that she is much more likely to punish and maybe punish harshly. She's also much more likely to be depressed, and so those are all bad factors for quality parenting. And this can result in a coercive cycle between the mother and children, especially sons, because the son's behavioral problems cause the mother to react more harshly, which of course perpetuates the problems. About 90% of mothers retain custody of their children following a divorce, and fathers have visitation. Parental contact, unfortunately, tends to diminish over time, especially for the father, especially if he remarries. And then if he has kids after remarriage, then most fathers completely lose interest in their child, which is sad. Now, you can go through divorce mediation, which nowadays is really common. It's an arrangement where the parents meet with a professional mediator, help them to arrive at decisions that are best for the children, and it really helps to lower conflict, so that's highly suggested, and many times it's required with divorce. Children's responses to remarriage. When divorced parents remarry, they create a step family or a blended family, and the remarriage is experienced negatively in the middle childhood ages. And really, it's experienced negatively in all ages, but it's pretty severe in middle childhood. Even though it improves the family's economic situation and the mother's well-being is enhanced, children don't react well to it in middle childhood. Remarriage, interestingly, is generally harder on girls than it is on boys, and if a child is still in like the 2 to 5 years of recovering from divorce, then the children tend to have a setback if you get married within that time period. So I always tell people, don't get remarried for at least 5 years, and the research really supports that. And it's worse, it's really bad if it's a blended step family, meaning that there are stepchildren coming into it. So it's hard enough if mom has just remarried a guy and he comes into the family. But if he brings children with him into the family, then the mother's children really struggle. Remarriage is problematic because it's disruptive. Stepfathers are viewed as interlopers. They're impinging on the kid's territory, and children very often resist dad's authority, stepdad's authority. However, if the new family process is good, they're able to communicate and learn to get along. This is often because the stepfather is very warm and democratic. And it helps if the children are younger, and this all creates a better transition to a blended family.